Good morning, everyone. We have a live audience here at St. John's Cathedral, as well as some folks who are joining us via Zoom, and others who are watching the presentation through the general St. John's page. And so we welcome all of you today. Professor Alter will speak for about 50 minutes. And then there will be time for questions. Those of us who are here live, I'll bring a microphone to you. If those of you who are wanting to ask questions either in the Zoom room or in the general Facebook page have a question, we ask you please to either put it in chat or raise your hand in the if you're in the Zoom location. This is a new technology of trying to do these things in a hybrid way. But it does give us the opportunity to have wonderful presenters such as Professor Robert Alter. Professor Alter is the Emeritus Professor of Hebrew and Comparative Literature at the University of California at Berkeley. One of the wonderful things, Professor Alter, about you is that you bring both your expertise as a scholar of literature as well as a scholar of the Bible, and bringing those two together. I would say, sir, that probably the book that really changed my whole worldview on biblical studies was The Art of Biblical Narrative. Let me tell you why that's true. Because biblical scholars for many generations have been focusing on how to take apart the literature of the Hebrew Bible, the various sources that went into the composition of the Torah, for example. But what Professor Alter did, and his work in particular, and others, but particularly that book, taught us, let's not focus so much on on tearing things apart. Let's think about who this wonderful editor is of these books and how they put everything together so that the text was as a whole. So I think, Professor Alter, for me, that was the greatest insight that I have received from much of your work. And you have spent your whole life in many ways reading these texts, and your magisterial translation of the Hebrew Bible that just came out in 2018 is just a wonderful work. And so we are so pleased to have you with us today. And I'm going to turn it over to you without further ado, but ask you if you want to add something to your introduction to what I've said. We invite you to do that. But we are so honored and pleased to have you with us today. Thank you, Professor Alter.
Very kind words. I have to say that this occasion is evidence to me that we are seeing light at the end of the tunnel, because I've done, as you can imagine, quite a few Zoom talks over the last number of years. This is the first one where I see a live audience in front of me. By the way, you're frozen. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I got a little worried because your image was frozen. Let me. Okay. I'll just say one thing to, of course, I don't want to introduce myself, but one thing to add to the introduction. When I began writing about biblical narrative all those years ago, I thought, well, I'm a literary critic. I've honed my skills on Flaubert and James Joyce and Nabokov, and I'll bring those skills to bear on the Bible. That was partly true, but the other half of the story was that in reading the Bible closely, I was learning a lot about how literature works. And the Bible, in a way, taught me things about its own distinctive operations. Now, I want to say just a few preliminary words on the David story in general. I know you've already had an overview in your course. This is, well, for my money, it's one of the greatest narratives was produced in the whole ancient world. And the greatness consists in a couple of different things. First, there's a very subtle and complex representation of human motives and human relationships and psychology. I heard a little beeping sound. I trust everybody is still hearing me. The visual display is a little odd. Whoops. There seems to be a kind of technical difficulty. Can you hear me? Yeah, somehow your image has gone from the screen, but I will get it back in one way or another. Here we go. It also is the only narrative I'm aware of in the whole ancient world which represents a human life evolving through time, changing through the pressure of circumstances, and then going into decline at the end. Like, you know, Odysseus is the same Odysseus every morning that he wakes up, even after those 20 years in fighting at Troy and the wandering through the Mediterranean. Whereas David is a good-looking, heroic young man. Everybody loves him. Then he becomes a rather hard-bitten warrior. Then he gets entangled in all sorts of political circumstances. And at the end, of course, we see him as an old man shivering in bed, unable to be warm, no longer capable of sexual activity, and probably a little bit mental befuddled. So this is very touching and very wrenching. Also, I would say that the David story is one of the greatest stories we have in the whole Western tradition of man as a political animal. And what politics and the struggle for power and the need to retain power do to a human being. So now, one last thing in light of the kind introductory remarks about my not paying attention to disparate sources very much, but looking at the continuities of the narrative. Biblical scholarship for a long time, since the 1920s, has claimed that the whole David story has several disparate stories that were stitched together. There's a story of the young David, the rise of David to power, the succession narrative. All those are claimed to be different stories. Now, this view of the book of Samuel has continued to obtain in most circles of biblical scholarship. And I think it's dead wrong. Whereas in the Pentateuch, I certainly recognize that there are several different sources that have been edited together. I do not think that's the case in the book of Samuel. To begin with, there's absolutely no stylistic evidence of a switch from the so-called rise of David narrative to the succession narrative or whatever. Secondly, the stories, and this goes back to the story of Saul before David appears on the scene, they're tightly interwoven by recurring motifs. I'll just mention one that takes us from Saul to David. When the prophet Samuel, after, this is at the very beginning of the book, when Hannah has the prophet Samuel as her first child, she is promised to consecrate him to the sanctuary at Shiloh, which she does really after she finishes weaning, and weaning in the ancient world might have gone on till the age of 3 or 4. And then we're not told anything about her feelings except one extraordinary short sentence. And each year when Hannah came up to the sanctuary at Shiloh, she would make him a little cloak, mother's love. And the little cloak, the Hebrew word is me'il, then becomes a big cloak. And it follows Samuel and Saul through the whole story. You remember Saul when he falls asleep in the cave, David cuts a corner of his cloak off. I won't mention all the instances, but the one that I particularly like, when the necromancer at Endor is asked by Saul to conjure up the spirit of Samuel so he will know how the battle against the Philistines the next day will go. This spirit comes up from the underworld and it's wearing a cloak, a me'il. So he knows right away that it's Saul. Anyway, that's my pitch, that I do think this is one continuous story. Now, what we're going to look at, and since this is both a class and a lecture, is I'd like to do a consecutive reading in the time allotted to me, is the pivotal chapters 11 and 12 in 2 Samuel, because I think everything changes in the story at this point. I may have to skip over some sections in order to pull this in by around 20 after 10, but we'll see. So if you have a biblical text, do open it to 2 Samuel 11. And I'm going to be reading from my own translation. And it happened at the turn of the year, at the time the kings sally forth, that David sent out Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah. And David was sitting in Jerusalem. Okay, now the story begins with what I think is an orthographic pun, which of course you can't possibly translate. The Hebrew word for kings is melachim. The Hebrew word for messengers is malachim. It's almost the same, just a slight difference in the vowel at the beginning, which I hope you could hear in my pronunciation. Now, the Hebrew text shows malachim, messengers, in the body of the text, but there's a marginal note that says, no, you have to pronounce this as milachim, kings. And of course, everybody, including myself, translated as the time the kings sally forth. But I think that orthographic pun is very meaningful for understanding how the story unfolds, because there is a king here who is dependent on messengers, on malachim. And what this means is that the whole ground on which David is exercising power has shifted radically. That is, he now sends an expeditionary force out across the Jordan to battle with the Ammonites, and he's in Jerusalem. He's sitting in Jerusalem. And the Hebrew word, the Hebrew verb means both to stay and to sit. And I chose to render it as to sit in order to highlight the way that verb suggests David's inaction, his passivity. He has become a sedentary monarch. And those of you who did Latin in school may remember that the adjective sedentary comes from a Latin word that means to sit. He's sitting. while the army is out fighting maybe 70, 80 miles away across the Jordan. And that imbalance, which is even reflected in the imbalance of the Hebrew sentence, spells trouble. And it happened at eventide that David arose from his bed and walked about on the roof of the king's house, and he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. He gets up from his siesta at eventide. So it's a rather long siesta. And that in itself indicates how he has become an all too relaxed, passive monarch. And the day is cooling off, and he sees a woman. He sees her naked, of course. That's his first sighting of this very beautiful woman. I can say autobiographical, my first sighting of my wife, who was very beautiful, was of course not naked, but she was wearing a bikini. It was at the university swimming pool. But I didn't get into trouble the way that David did. And David sent and inquired after the woman. And the one he sent said, "Why, this is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam, wife of Uriah the Hittite." Now, something funny is going on here. This woman, or let's say her husband, Uriah, is his neighbor. The house is close enough that he gets a good view from the balcony of or is it the roof? The roof of the king's house. The Hebrew doesn't have a specialized word for palace, so I follow the Hebrew. And that's important because we have a bouncing back and forth between two houses, Uriah, Bathsheba's house, and the king's house. So he doesn't, even though Uriah is a fighter in one of his elite corps, he doesn't know anything about the wife. So it begins to suggest something else about David. That is, David, through the first half of this story, has been very savvy. And now he seems to be a little bit out of touch. He doesn't know altogether what's going on around him. Now, the other thing that's important to note is he has to find out about who that woman is. And then he has to send a message to her. So all along, the king, as befitting a monarchy that's become a bureaucratic monarchy, has to depend on agents, has to depend on messengers. And that, of course, in itself spells trouble, because he performs an act that he wants to keep a deep, dark secret, but there's no way to keep it a secret because all these messengers are going back and forth. And David sent messengers, that's malachim, as against malachim, kings. David sent messengers and fetched her, and she came to him, and he lay with her, she having just cleansed herself of her impurity, and she returned to her house. Now, the impurity, of course, is menstruation. So we get this particular fact because we know from the get-go there is no way she could be pregnant by her husband. And the woman became pregnant and sent and told David and said, "I am pregnant." Now, these are the only words that amazingly that Bathsheba pronounces in the whole story. Toward the end of the David story, in the confusion about the succession to the throne, she will have a lot to say, but not here. Only the bare fact of her pregnancy, and we don't know what kind of a woman she is. The way she appears in the end of the story, which would be at the beginning of First Kings. That is, the story goes on into the first 2 chapters of Kings. It looks to me like she's a woman who has her eye on the main chance. That is, that she's not flabbergasted or profoundly disturbed by the fact that she's pregnant. And of course, a time like 6 weeks would have had to pass before, at the very least, before she realizes that she's pregnant. But she may think that this could be an opportunity to be pregnant by the king. And David sent to Joab, "Send me Uriah the Hittite." And Joab sent Uriah the Hittite to David. So there's this, along with the word messenger, what you do with a messenger is you send a messenger. So the verb to send is the other recurring term in this story. He's sending back and forth, and again, he may be inadvertently revealing his secret, or at least arousing a suspicion. That is, the general, Joab, might well say to himself, well, why in the middle of a siege against Ammon does David want one particular fighter to go back to Jerusalem? And Uriah came to him, and David asked how Joab fared, and how the troops fared, and how the fighting fared. And David said to Uriah, "Go down to your house and bathe your feet," which of course is what a traveler does, because the terrain of the whole area is very dusty and sandy. And Uriah went out from the king's house, and the king's provisions came out after him. So he has a catered dinner that he sends along after Uriah. And Uriah lay at the entrance to the king's house with all the servants of his master, and he went not down to his house. So he's disobeying what looks almost like an order from the king. And David said to Uriah, "Look." And they told David, saying, "Uriah did not go down to his house." And David said to Uriah, "Look, you've come from a journey. Why have you not gone down to your house?" Now, of course, what David wants is for him to go to his house and have sex with his wife, which will cover up the pregnancy by adultery, for which he is responsible. Then Uriah makes a little speech. "The ark and Israel and Judah are sitting in huts, and my master Joab and my master's servants are encamped in the open field. And shall I then come to my house to eat and to drink and to lie with my wife?" Now, notice David did not mention that. That was the thing that he wanted, that he was careful not to mention. But it seems to be a clue that Uriah has picked up. And he adds that telling detail, "to lie with my wife." Now, I want to go back for a minute to 2 different readings of the story that are, in a way, I would say, held in suspension. Back in the late 60s, 2 young, bright, and rather brash young Israeli scholars published in a Hebrew journal a very long article, it's about 50 pages, called "The King in Ironic Eyes." And what they argued is that there are 2 possible readings of the story that are held in suspension. One is that Uriah has heard, because there would be courtiers, people in the king's circle who would be whispering about what happened. He's heard that David has slept with his wife. And in that reading, he is in a way sticking it to the king. He is playing the role of the perfect conscientious soldier of Israel, and also playing a kind of dangerous game in prodding the conscience of the king. That's one possibility. The second possibility is that he hasn't heard, that all the people in the palace who do know about it have been very careful to keep mum to help cover up the king's secret. And in that case, Uriah is the vehicle of dramatic irony. That is, he doesn't really know the full implications of what he's saying, but as a loyal soldier, this is what he says, and he throws in to lie with my wife because that would go with a package. So if this is, I find that this plausible proposal, and it shows how extraordinarily sophisticated this writer was, that he does something that only certain modern novelists have done in constructing this story very carefully in a way that it can be read in two different fashions. Let me add something about his identity as a Hittite. That means he's not a native Israelite. Now, we don't know if he's an immigrant who then becomes a loyal soldier of Israel, or whether his family has immigrated to Israel before his birth. He does have a Hebrew name, Uriah, which has the Israelite theophoric suffix of Yah. But the pointed irony, and there's no double reading here, the pointed irony of his identity as a Hittite is that he is the good soldier of Israel, whereas his king has been sitting in Jerusalem, and then from sitting has gone to lying with his wife. So it is a painted and pointful and pointed irony. And David called him, and he ate before him and drank, and David made him drunk. So this is a strategy of desperation, which is maybe if I get him drunk, he'll then stagger down to his house and have sex with his wife. And he went out in the evening to lie in the place where he lay with the servants of his master, but to his house he did not go down. And it happened in the morning that David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hand of Uriah. And he wrote in the letter saying, "Put Uriah in the face of the fiercest battling and draw back so that he will be struck down and die." Now, David, first of all, has conceived a strategy of getting rid of the inconvenient husband, which is similar to the clumsy and failed strategy that Saul directed against him early in the story. You remember Saul said, yes, you can marry my daughter if you bring back 100 Philistine foreskins. And Saul says to himself, let not my hand be against him, let the hand of the Philistines be against him. So Saul thought that was a guaranteed formula for getting David killed by the enemy on the battlefield. Of course, it didn't work because David is too proficient a warrior. Now, we should follow this particular arc of the story for a moment. Things are done through messengers. Oh, one further thing. He sends these instructions to Joab in a rolled parchment scroll, presumably with a wax seal, with the full confidence that Uriah, as a loyal soldier, would not dream of opening it. So he's going back to Ammon carrying his own death sentence. Now, the feature of the story that's worth calling attention to is that David and gives directions, and then Joab gives directions, which are through messengers, through malachim, and then those directions are altered. It's the problem of working through intermediaries, that intermediaries may not do exactly what you direct them to do. And it happened, as we'll see this right now, and it happened as Job was keeping watch on the city, that he placed Uriah in the place where he knew there were valiant men. And the men of the city sallied forth and did battle with Job. And some of the troops, some of David's servants fell, and Uriah the Hittite also died. So what has Joab done? Joab is a ruthless practitioner of realpolitik. And he realizes that David's instructions are kind of stupid, because if the fighting men approach the wall of Ammon, and then everybody draws back, and there's Uriah all by himself, and he gets killed, well, it's obviously a plot to get him killed. So very unflinchingly, Joab says, well, if this is going to work out, other men have to die. That is, he puts a whole unit of fighting men, and a lot of them get killed, including Uriah. So human life is not a key value in Joab's worldview. So the circle of the consequences of David's adultery widen and widen. So quite a few warriors are killed. And Joab sent and told David all the details of the battle, and Joab charged the messenger, saying, when you finish reporting all the details of the battle to the king, if it should happen that the king's wrath is roused, and he says to you, why did you approach the city to fight? Did you not know they would shoot from the wall? Who struck down Abimelech, son of Jerubosheth? Did not a woman fling down on him an upper millstone from the wall, and he died in Tebetz? Why did you approach the wall? Then shall you say, your servant Uriah the Hittite also died. Okay, the story about the woman and the millstone occurs in the book of Judges, and it's apparently a kind of like a precedent that's invoked at ancient West Point. You don't get too close to the wall, right? But it's a woman who kills him. So I think that Joab is on to what David's done, that it's just a woman's fault that Uriah is going to get killed. But now, let's see what the messenger does with Uriah, with Joab's instructions. And the messenger went and came and told David all that Joab had sent him for. And the messenger said to David, the men overpowered us and sallied forth against us into the field. And then we were upon them back to the entrance of the gate, and they shot at your servants to the wall. And some of the king's servant died, and your servant Uriah the Hittite also died. Now, what the servant has done is in contradiction to the instructions he got from Joab. He's supposed to wait for David to say, why did you approach from the wall? But he doesn't want to wait. Why didn't he want to wait? Because David has a certain track record for killing messengers who bring bad news. He does that with the Amalekite who brings in the news of the death of Saul. He doesn't want to take any chances. So he knows what David really wants to hear is the death of Uriah. So again, the secret has spread out. And let's look just for a moment at David's response. And the king said to the messenger, thus shall you say to Joab, let this thing not seem evil in your eyes, for the sword sometimes devours one way and sometimes another. Battle all the more fiercely against the city and destroy it and so rouse his spirits. Okay, but David's response to the report of the death of Uriah and the other men is perfectly callous when he says, for the sword sometimes devours one way and sometimes the other. It's like a soldier's slogan, like every bullet has its billet. You know, people get killed in fighting, so they got killed. It's too bad, but go on with the battle. Okay, so at that point, Uriah is cleared out of the way. Bathsheba keens for her husband, and once the period of mourning is over, David takes her as his wife. Of course, she's part of a harem. And only at the very end of the chapter, and remember the chapter divisions are medieval. This is not part of the original, but it does mark the end of a unit in this story. And the thing that David had done was evil in the eyes of the Lord. So at this point, we finally get a moral judgment on David by saying the indication that it's evil in the eyes of the Lord. Now, at that point, I'm not going to read the whole thing because I want to close down in about 15 minutes, but we'll do the beginning. Chapter 12, Nathan the prophet, who has not been mentioned at all in the narrative, and the prophet in these early books, before we get to Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so forth, are not figures who speak publicly as do the so-called writing prophets later on, but they are in particular, they admonish kings when the kings have strayed. And the Lord sent Nathan to David, and he came to him and said to him, 2 men there were in a single town. One was rich and the other poor. The rich man had sheep and cattle in great abundance, and the poor man had nothing save one little ewe that he had bought. And he nurtured him, and he nurtured her, and raised her with him together with his sons. From his crust she would eat, from his cup she would drink, and in his lap she would lie. And she was to him like a daughter. And a wayfarer came to the rich man. It seemed a pity to him to take from his own sheep and cattle to prepare for the traveler who would come to him. And he took the poor man's ewe and prepared it for the man who had come to him. And David's anger flared hot against the man, and he said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, doomed is the man who has done this. And the poor man's ewe he shall pay back fourfold, inasmuch as he has done this thing, and because he had no pity. And Nathan said to David, you are the man. Now, David's reaction to this story is another indication that he is losing it, that he is not picking up clues. Why? This is a parable. And one way you can tell the parable is that the language is entirely different from the language of the surrounding narrative. It's a kind of sing-song, rhythmic. 2 men there were in a single town. One was rich and the other poor. And then that lovely little sequence of monosyllabic nouns. From his crust she would eat, from his cup she would drink, in his lap she would lie. And actually in the Hebrew, there are also certain words that never appear in the surrounding narrative. They seem to be parable designated diction. But he doesn't get the clue that the Israelite audience would have gotten, that this is a parable. So he thinks it's a real thing, and he denounces the man who has done this, at which point Nathan says, "You are the man." Now, the way this works is like the play within the play in Hamlet. Remember, Hamlet says, "The play's the thing with which I'll catch the conscience of the king." So here it's the parable's the thing with which I'll catch the conscience of the king. Okay, I'm not, in order to save time and get to the end of the story, I won't go on to read Nathan's words to David, but they are a scathing denunciation in which he says that the sword will never turn away from your house. It's a curse. And this seems to me one of the haunting contradictions of the whole story, that the house of David is the divinely authorized dynasty. And this story, the whole David story, is about the founding of the dynasty. But it's also a story about the fall of the house of David. That is, from the moment that he commits adultery with Bathsheba, things begin to fall apart. The next thing that will happen, a sexual transgression answering his sexual transgression is that his son Amnon rapes his half-sister, the beautiful Tamar, and then her brother Absalom has Amnon murdered. And it goes on in a kind of chain reaction to the end of the story. The writer, I think, who has understood this best is William Faulkner in his great American novel, Absalom, Absalom, which is about someone who found a dynasty in sin, Thomas Sutpin, and it's all about the fall of the house of Sutpin. Okay, I'm going to skip down to the end of the story, which is, I think, quite remarkable. The child born to David and Bathsheba is sickly, and it's not clear that the boy will survive. And David implores God to save the child, and he fasted. I'm reading now from verse 16 in chapter 12. David fasted, and he came and spent the night lying on the ground. So what's he doing? He's doing the same thing that Uriah did, but for a very different reason. And the elders of his house rose over him to rouse him from the ground, but he would not, nor did he partake of food with them, just as evidently Uriah refused this feast that David sent after him to his house. And it happened on the seventh day that the child died. And David's servants were afraid to tell him that the child was dead. For they said, "Look, while the child was alive, we spoke to him and he did not heed our voice. And how can we say to him, the child is dead? He will do some harm," presumably harm to himself. And David saw that his servants were whispering to each other, and David understood that the child was dead. And David said to his servants, "Is the child dead?" And they said, "He is dead." Dead. That word echoes. Now comes the extraordinary thing. David rose from the ground and bathed and rubbed himself with oil and changed his garments and came into the house of the Lord and worshiped, and came back to his house and asked that food be set out for him. And he ate. And his servant said, "What is this thing you've done? For the sake of the living child, you fasted and wept, and when the child was dead, you arose and ate food?" And he said, "While the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I thought, who knows, the Lord may favor me, and the child will live. And now that he is dead, why should I fast? can I bring him back again? I am going to him, and he will not come back to me. Every time I read that, it kind of grabs me by the throat. So what's happened? With the death of the child, and this I think often happens with the death of someone that you were deeply attached to, David suddenly faces his own mortality. I am going to him. He will not come back to me. And this is an extraordinary kind of existential moment for David, which is utterly different from everything he said in the narrative up to now. That is, if you follow all his statements from the beginning of his story, when he professes to have no interest, to be unworthy to marry the daughter of the king, to all his professions of innocence when people from the house of Saul die one after the other. Every single statement that David has made in the narrative up to this point can be construed, and probably is, a statement with a political calculation. For example, when he says, I am from the least of the people of Israel, I am unworthy to marry into the house of the king. Maybe that's court etiquette. Maybe he feels unworthy. But the most likely explanation is that he recognizes that marrying the daughter of the king will give him a claim to the throne. And he knows that he's been secretly anointed to be king by the prophet Samuel. So he plans to become king. And that's pure political calculation. But at this moment of grief, he now faces his own mortality. And what he says to his courtiers is nothing that be construed as political calculation. I am going to him. He will not come back to me. And from this point on in the story, we see David as a vulnerable figure who is moving by slow stages toward the fulfillment of his own mortality, and seems to be at the mercy of people around him, above all, the mercy of his henchman Joab, and manipulated by them. When David, lying virtually on his deathbed, shivering under the covers, needing the Shunammite woman as a kind of hot water bottle to keep him warm, he seems to be befuddled, and he's manipulated by the prophet Nathan and by Bathsheba to declare that Solomon is his legitimate successor. So it's, you can see a very poignant story about human vulnerability and how things change as the circumstances of life change. And David, at this pivotal moment in the story, has precipitated the change of circumstances by committing this illicit act and then realizing all his human vulnerability. Okay, thank you for your attention. I'd like to spend a few minutes responding to your questions. I can look at the chat. Well, there aren't any questions in the chat, so I welcome questions from you out there.
Right. So what we'll do with the folks who are here is I'll pass around the microphone.
Oh, good.
And we'll see if there's any questions here. And then otherwise we'll have questions from the chat. We also noticed that Professor Stussy is with us, who's going to be our presenter in a few weeks. And we're saying on July 4th, actually, and we welcome you with us here. I know that you wanted to be with us today for Professor Alter's presentation, so we welcome you as well. We will see you in a couple of weeks. We're glad that you're with us today. Anyone here with questions for Professor Alter? Oh. Please speak right into the microphone too.
Well, Bathsheba, to me, I don't see really that you know one way or another whether she had an eye to the main chance.
That's true.
Okay, that's all. That was all my comment. Once that happened, once she was taken as the wife of David, then she angled for political power. But before, it's not clear to me one way or another that she had a choice about sleeping with the king.
No, you're quite right about that. And I would say this highlights one of the fascinating features of biblical narrative that is a token of its complexity. The stories are often set up, not invariably, but often set up so that it is quite ambiguous what the motivation, what the psychology of the character is. And it leaves you wondering and forces you to ponder different alternatives. I mean, one could read this, the fact that all we know about her is I'm pregnant, that, well, if the king orders me to get into bed with him, he's the king. I have no choice. So I'm going to do it. And then I'm faced with the consequences of having sex with him, which is pregnancy, something I didn't necessarily bargain for. So that's also a perfectly plausible reading. So I love that aspect of biblical narrative, that you can juggle different possibilities of reading the characters and their motives. The fact that she seems to be so calculating at the end maybe makes me inclined to think that she has her eye on the main chance, but I have no way of demonstrating that. And also to highlight how calculating she is, after David's death, when Adonijah asks if he can get the king's okay to marry the Shunammite woman, she goes to the king and couches this in such a way that she's sure Solomon will respond in rage and have Adonijah killed, which would clear away a competitor to the throne. That's pretty calculating.
Other questions from here?
I don't know whether this question may be completely out of left field, but
Go ahead.
I noticed it was kind of an interesting, you talked about the letters being sent from the king and the Hebrew word behind that. And then it's interesting that the prophet's name is Nathan, and he is sent by God to confront David. Is that part of that messenger picture that you were talking about?
Oh, thank you for that suggestion. That hadn't quite occurred to me, but I think you're right. That is, there are different kinds of sending. There is human sending, which is subject to interference, to modification, to slips, as we've seen it in the story. And then there is God sending his prophets to deliver a message, and there it's 100% reliable because the message comes from God. And in fact, the very last prophet in the canonical connection Malachi. Malachi is simply the English way of pronouncing Malachi, which means my messenger. So the prophets are thought of as messengers. Thank you for that point.
Is there anyone who has a question in the chat
I don't
or in
see it.
in the Zoom room generally?
This is
Vanessa
Vanessa.
is asking,
Just turned up.
Vanessa, do you want to just give your question?
Yes, because I'm having trouble typing in chat. I'm kind of puzzled and also fascinated that we have a lot of details about battle, about somebody throwing down rocks from a wall, and we put this guy out front to die. And then very quickly we shift gears to this parable about the man with the lamb. And it's like we went from real hard reality to a very interior story. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I think that the story of the poor man's ewe is supposed to be distant in its mechanisms, in the world it conjures up in those few sentences from the surrounding story. So that would go along with what I was saying. It's my son trying to call me for Father's Day, and he's not getting the idea that I can't pick up the call. But you see, my sons are loyal.
Thank you.
Say it again.
I said, thank you. That kind of goes along with your talking about how the language in that was unique. The language in the parable is unique. So
Yeah.
that whole part of the story is kind of set out from the rest of it. Thank you.
Right. For example, I couldn't do this in English because I couldn't think of an equivalent, but the word for poor man and the word for wayfarer are unusual words that never appear in the prose narrative.
There's a question from the Facebook room. Why doesn't David want Uriah to know about his encounter with Bathsheba? What would happen to David?
Well, it's more than poor form. It's off the limits for the king to have sex with the wife of one of his subjects, especially one of his subjects who happens to be a loyal soldier risking his life for the sake of David's kingdom, actually for the expansion of his kingdom. So he doesn't, in other words, there's nothing in ancient Israel like the right of the first night that was exercised, I guess, occasionally by the European aristocracy. So the king in a polygamous society can have his harem, but he doesn't have right just to call the wives of subjects to his bedroom. So that's why he wants it covered up.
Another question that I have based on perhaps the first question that was asked. What would happen if we decentered David and centered Bathsheba in the narrative? Could we then make a connection between what happens in just the next story with the rape of Tamar by Amnon, and that there's a trajectory set off of sexual violence in these stories? Is that a way that one could read the story?
Oh, absolutely. That is, I guess it's centering Bathsheba in the sense that it introduced, she's at the heart of the theme of sexual transgression. Otherwise, of course, the story focuses on David's guilt and all the dubious maneuvers and hot water that his guilt gets him into. But there is an absolute connection, and it's a kind of measure for measure thing almost. That is, he sinned sexually, and then one of his sons transgresses sexually, and that sets off a chain reaction within the royal family, because the son who committed the sexual transgression, maybe an even more extreme one because it's rape, is then murdered by his half-brother. And after that murder, Absalom is exiled and has to flee to the north to the kingdom of his wife. When he's grudgingly brought back by David to Jerusalem, relations between them remain uneasy. And then, of course, he usurps the throne. And he eventually gets killed when his forces are defeated by David's forces commanded by Joab. So you see, there's a whole train reaction beginning with a sexual act followed by another sexual act.
Do we have any questions from the folks that are in the Zoom room at this point?
I had a comment.
Sure.
Actually, I have two. I want to thank Professor Alter, who was also a inspiration for my career in biblical studies. I'm absolutely thrilled to hear him talking. But to go back to Vanessa's question about all those details of battle and then the little ewe lamb, buried in that conversation around the details of battle is this reference to Abimelech. And I just wanted to suggest that she might enjoy going back and looking at Abimelech's story in Judges. He launches his career as king by killing 70 of his brothers. He's
Yes.
not a shining
70 of them. Yeah.
of the goodness of kingship. So there's actually some kind of pointed references going on already in the part about the battles. And I'm a little more favorable to Joab. And I wonder if Joab, and this is not a new idea with me, but if he's kind of digging a knife into David by introducing that reference into the speech.
Oh, yes, I think he is. I would agree with that. And okay, well, this is a very apt comment. Thank you for it. Well, let me add just one thing to your comment. It shows how there's a lot of intricate intertextuality going on in biblical narrative, where you can't read one piece of narrative without thinking of another. Actually, in our story, this is something I pointed out in print. The story of the rape of Tamar has three key references to the Joseph story. And in each case, those references are reversed, but I don't want to take time to go into that.
I do want to say that I was asked just this past week by someone, well, how do you find those cross-textual references? And I said, well, the best way is actually to know, just keep reading through the Bible and you find them. But then I sent her to your translation. Because your notes on that are just so good. And in particular, I've worked with your notes on the Tamar story.
Yeah, and I would add that one of the things that motivated me to do my own translation is that many of the translations obscure these connections because they don't use the same words in one story that occur in another story.
Felicia.
I have a question about the word used for messenger and the word used for king.
Yeah.
They sound an awful lot alike. Is there is there a message in that? Are they making a reference to the fact that kings have always had, or they've always said that they've had divine right to do what they do, and in other words, being in a form of God's messenger? So are they saying, is that why they use the same word or a very similar word?
Well, no, it's real. They're words that are very close in sound, but they're not the same word. And let me give you a brief technical explanation about the Hebrew language. That it has usually 3 consonantal letters that make the root of the word. And in the case of the word for king, it's mem lamed chaf, that is like MLKH. In the case of the word for messenger, there is an aleph that comes after that lamed, which is the way we pronounce Hebrew. It's really not pronounced. It probably was gently voiced somehow or other in the biblical period, and it probably the M sound, the mem at the beginning, was not part of the root, because there is a verbal stem like that in Ugaritic that means to send. So I don't think the words are related.
Any other questions from this group? Eric?
This story always makes me wonder about the author's political intentions with it. Is this a narrative of a tribal society saying all kings are bad, or is it kind of just saying, well, there's a few bad apples? In other words, we can have kings, but this one's a bad one. Is it one or the other, or is it both that's being said?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Now, many biblical scholars talk about this story as, the whole book of Samuel, as a Davidite story. That is, it's the story comes to demonstrate the divine authorization of the house of David. And I think that that's not quite right. I think that the writer he seemed to be a kind of independent figure. He's certainly not a court functionary. And what he does is he presents a double view of the monarchy, which is, on the one hand, it is divinely authorized. That is, he's not going to question the fact that the house of David is the legitimate dynasty that should govern Israel. But because he has such a richly complex and I would say savvy view of politics and human nature, he realizes that monarchs can do terrible things. They can be corrupt. And of course, if you look in the book of Kings, you see that David is not alone among the kings of Israel in doing bad things.
I have a question with regard to the, maybe, I guess it's the dating of the book maybe, but how would you, first of all, date the final edition that we have in our received text, and how did it relate, do you think, to its own cultural context?
Well, that's a tricky question. Not a trick question, but a tricky one. There are endless debates among biblical scholars, and have been for a long time, about dating books. That is, there are some scholars that claim that the whole book of Samuel and a lot of other things was composed either in the Babylonian exile or perhaps even later in the Persian period. I think that doesn't wash. And one reason is linguistic. That is, biblical Hebrew, like any language, changes in time. And the sort of literary Hebrew that was used in the first Israelite Commonwealth, which was destroyed in 586, is very different from the kind of Hebrew that was used later, that you find, say, in the book of Jonah, that you find in Esther, of course, and even late books that try to be that are archivized and try to pass themselves as early books, like the Book of Ruth. There are little slips, like in those 4 short chapters of Ruth, there are maybe a dozen locutions that never occur in late biblical, in early biblical Hebrew, in the first Commonwealth, but are later usages. So I think that the core of the book was composed in the first Commonwealth. How close to the time of David, which David would be the 10th century BCE, I don't know. It could be as a century afterwards, and could draw on oral reports. It could be more than a century afterwards. And then it was edited, probably edited in the Babylonian exile. And you see certain inserted passages that stick out like sore thumbs, which are clearly the work of somebody in the Deuteronomistic school. So that's roughly my view of the composition. So it really reflects the core story, reflects the monarchy, maybe just a few generations after David.
So again, it would be cautionary tales for monarchs in a way, right?
Oh, yes, in part, absolutely.
Can you relate you were talking about the personal element of David's lament over his lost child. Do you think that that's related to the end of the lamentation over Saul and Jonathan, especially when it becomes so personal, where a public lament becomes a personal one?
No, I think it's different. The way it's different is this. To begin with, the lament after Saul and Jonathan are killed in the battlefield is poetry. And the poetry is a very formal and, I would say, public vehicle, which David doesn't at all use here. And it has a political calculation. That is, David, when after all, Saul sought to kill him, and he's going to displace the house of Saul as monarch. So the last thing he wants his listeners to think is that he took any pleasure in the deaths of Jonathan and Saul. And so he praises them, and he talks about the love between him and Jonathan, which he never expressed during Jonathan's lifetime. Jonathan did express his love toward him, but not the other way around. So I think that the lament is still part of the political David.
Other questions from the in-person group? Any final questions from those who are in viewing in Facebook and those who are in the, we have one more over here.
I was just thinking about the fact that God warns the people that they really don't want a king, and they ask for a king. And you see kind of what transpires after that. There's just drama after drama, and it never really comes to any good. It was their whole disobedience was the reason they had a king in the first place, and then everybody suffered afterwards. So that was just interesting.
Yeah, well, I think that there's a certain ambivalence on the part of the writer about kingship. That is, the ideal form of governance would be direct rule inspired by God, who inspires the various judges, who are not judges, but they're really ad hoc military leaders. The problem with that is that it is strategically unfeasible, that in one story after another in the book of Judges, the response to conquering surrounding peoples is, even if it's victory, it's only temporary, and then there are more problems. So you're stuck with the fact that you can't muster enough power for national autonomy without kingship over all the tribes, or as it turns out, over 10 tribes and 2 tribes. But kingship is fraught with bad consequences.
Professor Alter, thank you for being with us today. Before we conclude, I'm wondering if we can conjure up Professor Marty Stussy for just a moment again. Professor Stussy, if you're able, could you just give us just a headline of what you'll be talking with us about on July the 4th? We want to make sure everybody comes on the 4th of July to be here for your presentation.
Bring your firecrackers.
Well, we had a question about reading the story that was discussed today from Bathsheba's point of view. One of the things that I find fascinating about the story of David is the complexity with which the minor characters are shown. I mentioned that I kind of like Joab. I've had several students over the years decide just to track Joab through the story. And the picture you get of this crusty old guard soldier who's so loyal to David, and yet he sort of represents what came before David. I'm not at all sure he's comfortable being David's hatchet man. And part of the reason he's so gruff is he's caught in that middle position of being caught between 2 kinds of duties. And he is the one who will, as we talked about with Abimelech, he's the one who can get in there and rebuke David. David doesn't like it. But although he says nasty things about Joab, Joab's too powerful and still there. So I love tracing these minor characters, and one that has really fascinated me is Saul's daughter, Michal, who loves David and is married to him early on. David leaves her behind, then demands her back. And you learn a lot about David from looking at the dynamics of his relationships with women and the pain of women's position as they are not simply objects of lust, but symbols of power in the story. It's not at all clear how much of Michal's story is about personal stuff between her and David and how much it's politics. And secondly, I am a little bit troubled by the things that Nathan says to David in the aftermath, after he tells the parable. Because God is represented not as angry that a woman has been taken, but that she was taken without asking. And in fact, God says, I already took your master's wives and gave them to you. So there's kind of a troublesome note of what it means for God to be backing David so strongly. But the redemptive note in it is that the tradition that gave us this story remembers what it cost the little people around David. And there are all these wonderful, touching stories of minor characters. So we will trace that one of Saul's daughter.
Thank you very much. So Professor Alter, we thank you so much for this time. It was very rich, and I personally was absolutely delighted to have this time with you going through this text. So blessings to you. We all want to give you our heartfelt thanks for being here. And we hope we see you again. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure.
And next week we do not meet, but on July 4th, Professor Marty Strucy will be back with us. Thank you all for being here today.
And enjoy Father's Day.